All right, so we've talked about the depressing stuff. We've talked about the loss of biodiversity. We've talked about endangered species and extinction. Today we're going to kind of flip it and now talk about what's being done to prevent the depressing stuff. The general idea on conservation and preservation is that diversity of organisms and ecological complexity are good things. The more diverse an ecosystem is, the more complex an ecosystem is, the more resilient that ecosystem is to change. The more resilient that ecosystem is to human impact. The more likely that that ecosystem would survive despite human interference or a natural disaster. We know that untimely extinction is a bad thing. We're not talking background extinction. We're talking about the fact that we are causing extinction at a faster rate than ever before. And we know that if we cause extinction, then we decrease complexity and biodiversity. Evolutionary adaptation is good, and biological diversity has an intrinsic value. If something has an intrinsic value, it means it has value as just being there. As just being alive, it has value. Not value to you as something that you can use, but value for itself. You've seen a lot of these acronyms before. You're going to see a lot of them again. Let me point out the most important ones on this list. The United Nations is a conglomerate of all of the governments that are getting together to have meaningful discussions on how to make the world a better place. A division or subset of the United Nations is the IUCN. IUCN is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. This is the group that makes the red list. Remember the categories of extinct, critically endangered, vulnerable, not threatened. Underneath IUCN, one of the boards that works is CITES. CITES is the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species. Once we put a species on the red list, on endangered or critically endangered, then there's going to be a discussion of the member states of the countries that are part of the IUCN or part of the United Nations on whether or not this species can be traded across international lines. Okay, so that's what CITES does. The other ones on here, the WWF, World Wildlife Fund, these are the ones that are non-governmental agency. It's the one that advertises on TV all the time that you can donate to, and then they do great things with that money as far as setting aside nature preserves, as far as funding guards for endangered species, as far as making sure that these organisms continue to exist. NGOs, GOs, and IGOs. An IGO is an intergovernmental agency or organization. This is a bunch of different governments talking about how they're going to deal with the issues in the environment. Realize that the issues of the environment don't end at borders. So when we talk about our California condors that we're re-releasing into the wild, these condors have huge ranges. And the ones that we release in Santa Barbara, some of them will actually fly into Mexico, spend a couple of days, and fly back. Well, we need to have an agreement with Mexico about the protection of those birds, because we can't protect them in the United States and then say, but if they cross the border, it's all fair game. We need to make sure that they're safe no matter where they go, and that's where intergovernmental organizations or agencies take place. Government organizations are funded by the government, which means their funding depends on who's in power. So who you elect is going to determine the importance of these governmental agencies and therefore the work that they can do during any term of a president for the most part. Obviously, President Trump, a lower value on the environment than some of our other presidents. And because of that, funding's been cut to a lot of these government organizations. That limits what they can do as far as protecting and conserving. They do research, regulation, monitoring, EPA, Forest Service, all of those are part of government organizations. Non-government agencies, or NGOs, non-government organizations, are not part of the government, and because of that, their funding is not dependent on who's in power. They don't have to go through all the red tape, right? If you're part of a government agency like the EPA, you're writing like 15 reports before anything gets done. An NGO can just go out and have action. They can make a change quicker. Very diverse groups. So you have World Wildlife Fund, which is somewhat conservative, and Greenpeace, which is very combative and liberal. So it's a very big span of how they go about doing what they need to do. Direct value of biodiversity. What does biodiversity do for humans? The first one is our food source, and we've talked about this before. We want a wide variety of food sources, and that comes from nature. So our biodiversity is what allows us to have wheat bread, corn bread, white bread, spelt bread. Those are all different grasses that then we've harvested for our own use. And that biodiversity gives us this variety in those grasses. We've talked about the fact that we preserve heritage seeds. So as we're doing selective breeding, as we're doing genetic modification, if we mess it up, we can go back to what it was originally before we played with it. We get natural products from our biodiversity. We're going to get medicine. So aspirin comes from the bark of a tree, believe it or not, originally. We get fertilizers. There are people that go into caves and collect bat poop, guano, because it's high in phosphorus. And then you can buy that at your local gardening store and put it on your garden. Pesticides. We know that eucalyptus oil, which is the oil that comes off these trees that are out in our kind of campus, repels bugs. And so we can harvest that oil and use it as a natural pesticide. All of this is a value of our biodiversity and why we need to maintain it. Indirect value of biodiversity, the other things that biodiversity does for us. The first one is environmental services. An environmental service is something the environment does, and it's just being the environment that benefits man. First one is pollination of crops. If I have a big cornfield, I need all of that corn pollinated. My bees and my birds and my animals that are going through the cornfield are going to collect pollen on them and then distribute it on the next plant over. So I don't have to go out there manually with like a cotton swab and pollinate all my plants. They're going to do this for me. Obviously, our plants provide oxygen, and on the opposite end of that, they are taking in carbon dioxide. So our plants, our forests, are carbon sinks. So as we're polluting the environment by driving our cars with all of the carbon dioxide, the trees that are out there are sucking it in. That's going to help prevent climate change. If we get rid of the trees, we get rid of that ecological service. There is scientific and educational value in our biodiversity. You guys saw the lizards that were in the trap, and I talked about how a lizard can lose its tail and regrow it. That ability to regenerate, if I can figure out how the lizard does that, what genetic mechanisms are in that lizard to regrow lost limbs, maybe we can apply that knowledge to humans and come up with a way for humans to regenerate lost limbs. There is an indirect value as far as biological controls, and I talked about how you guys can go buy ladybugs and sprinkle them on your rose bushes and they'll eat all the aphids. That's a value of biodiversity. Recreation and ecotourism. There is a value for how pretty the environment looks. So if you go to Costa Rica and you pay your money to go through the rainforest and see the monkeys and the lemurs and all of that, that's a service that rainforest is providing the people of Costa Rica, because lots of money goes into that economy based on us wanting just to come and see nature. Gene pools. We are now big into genetic modification. I can take the gene from a glowing jellyfish and put it into a mouse and make the mouse glow. Kind of a pointless experiment, but it looks cool. We can get the genes from these organisms that might be beneficial. And then biorights, the idea that every living thing has the right to maintain its life, to continue living. two terms that we incorrectly use interchangeably: conservation and preservation. In our minds, it means that we're keeping our animals and our biodiversity, but the way that conservation is done is very different than the way preservation is done. Conservation means I can still utilize that resource. I can still go in and have ecotourism. I can still go in and log, as long as what I'm doing doesn't harm the environment in a way that's not sustainable. I can go in and harvest teak as long as I'm not clear cutting the forest. That's conservation. I'm conserving the environment, but I'm still using it. Very different than preservation. Preservation says no human activity. I can't mine, I can't log, I can't have ecotourism. I'm going to set this land aside and leave it pristine, and I'm not going to touch it, enter it. It's going to stay exactly how it is. Preservation is obviously harder than conservation. You can still financially gain from the environment if you do conservation. You cannot have financial gain if you're doing preservation. There is a battle between conservation and preservation, and that's economics. This battle is often fought during elections. So the extent to which we use our natural resources, or that we're allowed to use our natural resources, is determined by who's in leadership. Who is your governor? Who's your president? Who are your congressmen and your senators? They're the ones making the laws. They're the ones that are setting aside the land. And so when you go to the polls, you are voting on how much conservation you want, how much preservation you want. Obama, in his last year, set aside huge amounts of land for conservation. Trump, in his first days, went in and reversed a bunch of that. But this is where you are voting at the election booth on how you want your environment to be treated for the next 4 years. You, as a consumer, are also voting with your money. Conservation versus preservation versus downright just using the resources. A couple of years ago, during our extreme drought, Arrowhead Water Company, it came out, we were in a 7-year drought at the time, that they were bottling their water from a spring in the mountains that they didn't have water rights to. That their permit to pull water from that spring had expired 15 years prior. No one had really caught on, but now it became a big deal because we're in a 7-year drought, and if they're bottling that water, the environment isn't getting that water, and that environment needed it. The animals and the plants needed the water. So how did consumers vote with their money? We stopped buying Arrowhead water. So the companies and the products that you buy, you are choosing with your money whether or not you're going to support a company and their environmental policies. I talked briefly about CITES. You guys, freshman year, probably saw Racing Extinction, where if you'll remember the movie, if you remember the scene, it's all the shark fins up on the roof drying. Well, part of that movie was the manta rays, and they were harvesting the manta rays only for the gills, not for the meat, not for anything else, just the gills, because in Chinese medicine, that was supposed to cure everything. Manta rays are endangered. They're part of the red list. And so the filmmakers and the scientists went to CITES, the convention, and they presented their data. And then all of the countries involved voted on what appendix the manta ray would end up on. Appendix 1 says that that species can't be internationally traded, period. You can't move the product across international lines. Appendix 2 says you can trade that species as long as its hunting or harvesting is done sustainably. Appendix 3 says there is an issue here with that species, but one or more countries says, no, we need it to be harvested. And there's an exception made. All right, so with the manta rays, they brought it to a vote. All of the countries voted to put it on Appendix 1, but what country? China. China did not have a good enough valid reason to put it on Appendix 3, So the law was passed that you can't internationally trade any product of the manta ray. That then protected the manta ray from hunting. So the only issue with CITES is they basically say, look, it's an agreement between Indonesia and China that China will not import manta ray gills. Who enforces it though? Indonesian government on that side of the border and Chinese government on the other side of the border. CITES is not a governing agency. They can't go in and put people in jail for breaking this law and trading internationally. They have to have it on faith that the countries involved on placing it on an appendix are going to have the teeth to enforce that ruling. China said, go ahead, kill the manta ray. So is China going to enforce it? Probably not, but who is? Indonesia, where it's originating from. We have very successful captive breeding programs, very successful zoos. You guys are close to one of the most successful programs in San Diego. Captive breeding. We bring the animals into the zoo, we're caring for the animals, and we are encouraging the breeding of those animals. Either, mom and dad getting it on, or in vitro fertilization where I take egg and sperm in a test tube and I make an embryo, and then I put it in the animal. Very successful programs. The problem is, most of the time these species are endangered because their habitat is gone. So no matter how many I get in a zoo, there's nowhere to put them and release them in the wild. So they'll only exist in zoos. Here's the deal. We've been successful where habitat still exists. California condor is the best example of this. In the 70s, there were 25 California condors left in the wild, period. 25 of these birds. It's a bird with a 9-foot wingspan, and they are scavengers. So there were 25 left. The zoo saw the problem, the researchers, and they had conversations with the Chumash Indians. The Chumash saw the bird as a religious icon, and so they didn't want to see it in captivity. After a lot of discussion, the zoo kind of won, and they went out and captured all 25 birds. The way they would do this is they'd dig a hole in the ground, and someone would go stand in that hole with a tarp over them, and then in front of the hole they'd put carrion, dead meat. So the condor would land to feed on the meat, and they'd throw the tarp over the bird and collect it in. They got all the last 25 birds. They then started a captive breeding program down at the Wild Animal Park. There were a lot of pitfalls as they learned how to do this with the condors. The first pitfall is they were just feeding the birds, right? Just like you would feed any other animal at the zoo. Well, these birds learn to associate humans with food. So this is now a bird with a 9-foot wingspan that is released in the wild, and it sees you at the beach with your hot dog and swoops down to eat your hot dog. Not great press for the San Diego Zoo as this 9-foot bird is attacking people for food. That's why they went to puppet feeding. So now there was no human-bird interaction. It was all puppets. And so they didn't say oh, humans have food, I'm gonna go hang out with the humans. The next issue they had is in the enclosures there weren't power lines. And so the birds weren't learning that a power line was dangerous. And so the birds released would hit the power lines and die. So they put power lines in the enclosures to teach the birds the power lines aren't good. The next hurdle that happened was it is an intrinsic behavior in these birds to feed their babies bone fragments, bone chips, because that's how the baby birds would get calcium. Well, the birds that were released from captivity that are now in the wild and having their own offspring in the wild, huge success, that we not only can release the birds, but they're breeding out in their natural habitat again. We're doing this intrinsic behavior of feeding their offspring, but they didn't know the difference between bone chips and trash. So some of the first chicks that were hatched were dying, and they would do the necropsy, the autopsy, and open up the belly, and it would be filled with bottle caps and wire and all of this trash. So they started putting out, for the mama birds in captivity, bone chips, So the babies would then learn to recognize what a bone chip is, and then when they'd have their own babies, they would do it. So we're getting really good. There are 450 birds in the wild now. They are all tagged. They all have radio transmitters on their wings, so we can keep track of them. Breeding pair in Zion National Park. Breeding pairs up in pinnacles. In the mountains above Santa Barbara and in the Grand Canyon is where the most common releases in our area are, so you can go see them. But we are also now starting to release in Mexico because that's part of their habitat. The issue is in California, all of our bullets are non-leaded. Not the case in Mexico. And so a rancher kills something that's attacking its cattle and leaves that carcass there. Well, the bullet it killed it with has lead in it. And so then the condor lands there, eats the meat, ingests the bullet, and gets lead poisoning. This is where those radio transmitters come in handy, is that they notice the bird's not moving. The San Diego Zoo will actually go down to Mexico, collect the bird back up, bring it and rehab it, and then release it again. So you have to have that intergovernmental agency kind of cooperation to bring these birds back and forth across international lines, because guess what? They're on Appendix 1 of CITES. So if they don't have this intergovernmental cooperation, it's hard to get the birds back and forth. There's also an educational piece here of trying to get the ranchers to use non-leaded bullets, to realize that the condors are fine. We don't need to worry about them, but you have to do everything in your power not to harm them. Botanical gardens and seed banks we've talked about. A botanical garden is like a zoo for plants. And we do captive breeding with our endangered plants in botanical gardens to collect the seeds to put into seed banks. We have flagship species. Now, humans in general love the cute and cuddly looking and the big furry animals. And if I'm going to donate my allowance to something, it's going to be a cute, big, fluffy animal, like a polar bear or a panda or a mountain lion, because they're cute. And I want to like hug it and play with it. These become our flagship species. So if you donate to save the polar bear and you donate to the World Wildlife Fund, does that money only go to save the polar bear? It goes to all of the projects the World Wildlife Fund is funding. But the flagship species, the one that gets you to donate, is the polar bear. The other thing about our flagship species is if I save the polar bear, I also have to save its habitat, right? Well, if I save the polar bear, and therefore I have to save its habitat, I save everything else that lives in that habitat. If I save the panda, by means of saving the panda, I'm also saving everything else that lives in the area that the panda lives in. This is the benefit to flagship species. The downfall to flagship species is, once a year we see the picture of the emancipated, the skinny polar bear out on the ice that's like separated from everything, and oh my god, the polar bear is going to die, and therefore World Wildlife Fund failed. We can't save the polar bear. I'm not going to donate any more money. So you have to be careful that we're not picking one species that when it declines, everyone goes, oh, well, hope is lost, right? A keystone species we've talked about before. These are the ones that you put into an environment and they change it. You take out of the environment and the whole ecosystem collapses. So remember the sea otter that eats the urchins. If you don't have sea otters, the urchins go nuts and they eat the kelp forests, and now we lose that entire ecosystem. Beavers are important. They're keystone species because beavers dam rivers, and now you've got a lake where there was a river, and think about the difference of things that live in a lake versus a river. An approach to conservation is preservation of habitat, and that's making preserves, and we are really good about that in California. So O'Neill, Whiting Ranch, we have wildland over by Ladera. All of this is there to preserve nature by saying, look, we're going to have our homes, but we know that the mountain lions and the coyotes and the bunnies all need a place to live too, and so we're going to give them a little bit of land. Aren't we generous, right? We're going to let them have a little bit of their own land. There is a debate, though, between single large or several small preserves. They call it SLOS, right? Single large or several small. Single large, sufficient size, big enough that the animal has all of the territory it needs to mate and to find food. You can have more species if you have more habitat. Takes a lot more land though, and in California we're a little greedy with our land. Several small, greater range of habitat, so I can have one in the coastal region, one in the lower elevations of the mountains, then I can have at like 5,000 feet at Saddleback. I can really have a variety if I have several small. If you have an area where you have a rare species that's only found around this creek, I can preserve that creek with a small amount of land. If one habitat's destroyed, that's all right. There's a preserve, 5 miles away that might still survive. The problem is with several small, you have fragmented habitats. No single habitat is large enough to maintain our apex predators. No single habitat is large enough to have all of the territory for a mountain lion or something that needs a large range. Creates artificially high biodiversity with edge effect. In several small, some species like rats and raccoons and possums are going to thrive, and some are going to suffer like our mountain lions. When we look at our debate, and if I'm going to make my preserves, this is the preferable look, this is the less preferable. So if I'm going to make my reserves, I'd rather have one big one than one small one. If I'm going to make my preserves and I have to do 2 small ones, it's better if they're close together as opposed to far apart. Because if you're a mountain lion and you need a big range, here there's very little human impact to go from one preserve to another. Here, that's a lot of humans and houses and cars to get between. It's better to have it in a circle versus an oval. What am I minimizing by having a circle versus an oval? 2 words, both begin with E. Edge. Edge effect, right? So we want the least amount of edge because edge is what gives you that artificial biodiversity. Edge is where those generalists are going to thrive. If I have to have several small preserves, I want corridors between them so that organisms can move from one preserve to another. If you guys have driven up Alicia towards Santa Margarita, there's that kind of wild area right where those 2 roads meet. That's a wildlife corridor. That's to take the animals from one preserve to O'Neill, essentially. That's why on that fence, next time your parents drive it, look carefully. There are signs that say, warning, high mountain lion activity. Guys, along Antonio, as you're going from RSM to Ladera, there's the golf course over there, and between the golf course and the road, there's kind of the stream bed where cross-country runs. Guess what? Wildlife corridor, designed to move mountain lions from O'Neill to the wild area past Burr Park. That's why you don't want to be the slowest cross-country runner, because lots of mountain lions there. They are talking about building a wildlife corridor over the 405 freeway. Remember we talked about P51 got hit on the 405 trying to get across? They're talking about building a wildlife corridor over the top, basically a bridge that would have native plants on it that would allow the mountain lions to move. Here's the problem with the proposed plan right now. It's Southern California and we are anthropogenic. We are all about the humans. And yes, oh my gosh, what a great thing we would do by building this wildlife corridor. They're talking about putting a bike path on it, because now bikers can get over the freeway too. Anyone know what the person was doing who was killed by a mountain lion about 15 years ago in Whiting Ranch? He was mountain biking, right? So now we are putting humans where we are intentionally putting mountain lions. Not a great combination. Plus, do the mountain lions want to be where the humans are? No, so there's a lot of bikers or people walking or running, the mountain lions are going to go somewhere else, and they're still going to try and cross the freeway where there's not human impact. So if we are going to build corridors, we have to be very conscious about what we're putting in those corridors. That is the last of the information for your exam that you have on November 4th. Don't forget, there are study guides. Don't forget there is extra credit online. Some of y'all need it. You have the rest of the period, it's about 15 minutes, to work on the lab that's due tomorrow.